Well, welcome to the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center's book program. My name is Thorin Tritter. I am the Museum and Programming Director for the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center located in Glen Cove, New York. I'm delighted to welcome you today to our program with Professor Philippe Sands about his new book, The Ratline, The Exalted Life and Mysterious Death of a Nazi Fugitive. The book was just published by Knopf and came out last week and has been receiving a great deal of praise in various book reviews, including the New York Times, which I saw where Rachel Donadio described it as fascinating, important, and suspenseful. Three pretty good words. The book, as the subtitle explains, follows the life and death of one particular high-ranking Nazi, Otto von, I think the correct pronunciation is Vector, although it might look to the American eye like Wachter. However, this is much more than just a history of Vector, but we'll come back to that. Before I introduce Philippe Sands and talk more about this book, let me put in a plug for a couple of our other upcoming programs. First, let me mention that we had scheduled another program for later this afternoon, part of our Sunday with Survivors series, with a conversation and hearing the testimony from Stephen Berger. Unfortunately, because of the weather, Stephen Berger is unable to get to a place where he can use Zoom, so we've had to postpone that session and that program. We will reschedule it for later in the month. In terms of other programs coming up though, tomorrow on Monday at 7 p.m., I will be giving the third session of our four-part program on the history of Jews of New York City, with a talk focused particularly on the housing and settlement patterns of the Lower East Side in the late 1900s and the early 20th century. This series is free to members, but we do charge a minimal or a nominal $10 fee for non-members. On Tuesday, February 9th at noon, we will be hosting a virtual film screening and discussion about the film Stateless, Arrogant, and Lunatic, a film about Gilel Storch and the White Bus operation that rescued Jews from the Holocaust. Our panel discussion will include Marcus Storch, whose father pressured the Red Cross to act in 1944, and the filmmaker, Lena Einhorn, and it's going to be moderated by Tomer Adadi, Gilel Storch's grandnephew and a famous concert producer. And one more program to mention, later this week on Wednesday at noon, I will be holding my regular Curator's Corner, this time looking at an accordion in our collection that helped save the life of Alex Rosner. Okay, you can find more information about all of these programs and the rest of our schedule on our website at www.hmtcli.org under the events tab. Let's get to today's program, and I'll pull this, stop sharing this. I'm delighted to introduce our speaker this afternoon, the acclaimed writer, Philippe Sands, who is a practicing attorney and a professor of law at the University College London. As an attorney, Professor Sands specializes in international law, and he's written more than a dozen books in that field. To the general reader, I think he may be more well known for his 2016 book, East-West Street, which won a number of book prizes, including the British Nonfiction Book of the Year Award, and traced the personal and intellectual evolution of two men, Raphael Lemkin and Hirsch Lauterpacht, who simultaneously originated the ideas of genocide and crimes against humanity. In telling their stories, Professor Sands also drew the reader's attention to Otto Vector, and toward the end of the book, to Vector's son, Horst. Those two figures re-emerge in his new book, The Ratline, this time taking the center stage. And I will leave it there to ask Professor Sands to talk to us more about those two characters. One final comment before I pass the baton over to Professor Sands, and that is, I have a few questions that I'm going to start off with to ask Professor Sands about the book, but we also do encourage discussion from all of you out there. If you've got a question, please use the Q&A function of Zoom, type it in, and I will serve as a moderator to channel those questions to Professor Sands. So, with that introduction and a layout of our plan, let me welcome Professor Sands to our virtual stage, and I will also offer my heartfelt thanks for you joining us today.
Thank you, Thorin, and welcome everybody. Greetings from London, England, where we've got a little bit of snow. I would describe them as no more than flurries, but our friends in New York area have appraised us of what you're going through. So thank you so much for taking the time to turn up.
Maybe as a way to just get us started, can I ask you to give us kind of the elevator speech about your book, or some kind of short intro? What is the book about?
Sure. So just to give you a little bit of context and history, how did I come to write this? You've got to go back to 2010 when I received an invitation to give a lecture on the work that I do on international cases about mass atrocity, crimes against humanity and genocide. And I went to visit a city called Lviv in the Ukraine. It used to be Lvov in Poland, and before that, Lemberg in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And I went not because I had a burning desire to give a lecture, but because I wanted to find my grandfather's house. He was born there in 1904. One thing led to another. I discovered extraordinarily that the two men who invented the legal terms crimes against humanity and genocide used in the Nuremberg trial in 45 for the first time ever, Hirsch Lauterpacht and Raphael Lemkin, came from the same city. In fact, they studied at the same law school where I gave the lecture, but no one knew that fact. So that was pretty surprising. And then I came across a fourth man who became the fourth character in the book East-West Street, and that was Hans Frank. Hans Frank was Adolf Hitler's personal lawyer from 1928 to 1933, and then became a Minister of Justice in Bavaria, and then from 1939, Governor General of Nazi-occupied Poland. It was on his territory, or alongside it, that almost all the extermination camps were built. And in researching that book, I reached out to and found the son of Hans Frank, a man called Nicholas Frank, a journalist, actually a very lovely man, and we came to know each other very well. He detests his father. The first thing he said to me was, "Philippe, you need to understand, I'm against the death penalty in all cases, except in the case of my father." We carried on talking. We spent more time together. We visited. And then one day he said to me, "Philippe, you're interested in Lemberg, which is in the district Galicia in the government general, Nazi-occupied Poland. Perhaps you would like to meet someone I've come to know, the son of my father's deputy." My father's deputy was called Otto Wächter, and his son is Horst. You will like him. He's not German like me, he's Austrian, but he does take a very different view to me in relation to his father. He looks for the good in his father. His father too was indicted for mass murder, but escaped in 45 and disappeared off the face of the earth until he was discovered in 49 in Rome in a Vatican-run hospital on his deathbed in mysterious circumstances. And so the book is based on the remarkable family archive that Horst Wächter gave me. Horst and Nicholas and I made a film together. I obviously wrote East-West Street. We made a podcast. You can listen to it. It's on the BBC. It's free to listen to. It's called The Ratline. And in the midst of all of that, actually what happened was in the filming that we did in Lvov, there was an interview of Nicholas Frank, who expressed the view that perhaps Horst was a new kind of Nazi. I actually disagree with that. He's not an anti-Semite. He's not a Holocaust denier. We can talk more about that. But Horst was very upset, and he said to me, "How can I prove that I'm not a Nazi? I'm a courtroom litigator. It's very difficult to prove a negative. We all know that." I thought about it, and I said, "Well, Horst, you've got all these incredible documents. From the moment your mother and father met in 1929 to the moment your father died in 1949, why don't you give them to a museum and then scholars can form their view?" He said, "Terrific idea. Which museum?" I proposed the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, with whom I know you have contact. And Horst did a deal with them. They got the whole archive, and Horst then said to me, "Would you like a copy?" I said yes. And that was how the Ratline began. Every single letter that passed between his parents, their diaries, the family documents, and a story about love of the parents, about lies within the family, and justice and injustice. So that's the story in a nutshell.
Excellent. As I read the book, I felt like it was kind of three stories woven together. One, the story of Otto Vector and his rise in the Nazi Party, and then his escape, and the suspenseful part about what happened and how did he get away and what happened after he got away. A second story seemed to me about, as you've just described, about Otto's children, and Horst in particular, and how that family is dealing with the memory of having a father who was a mass murderer. And then a third kind of strand, if you will, I thought it was following you. It was following your exploration and your tracking down. And you're very much in this story as you described the whole process that you went through, although obviously crafted and to make it really an engaging read. Are those the three strands that you see in there? Am I missing some?
They are the strands, and we can touch on each of them. I'd add a fourth, and the fourth is Charlotte, Horst's mother. For me, in a sense, she is the beating heart of the book. Why do I say that? I say that because we really generally don't know about the spouses. We don't know what they did. We don't know what support they gave. And we know from our own lives that in a partnership or relationship between two people, both have an important role to play. So I was particularly interested in the role that she played before the war, during the war, and after the war. And for me, this was the most extraordinary aspect. So to give an example, you've read the book, so you're aware, 15th of March, 1938, Wächter Otto has returned to Vienna to take up a position as state secretary, where his job is to remove all the Jews from public office, 16,500 human beings, basically throw them out from their jobs. And he comes back, and the two of them stand on the famous balcony, many people who are watching will know the photograph, with Hitler to welcome the crowds, or the crowds to welcome them, in a rapturous Vienna. What happens afterwards is what's so fascinating, and it's the private documents that tell you so much. They go back inside the building, the Hofburg, they go down the vast marble staircase. I wanted to see for myself where it happened. And at the bottom of the staircase, Otto says to Charlotte, his wife, well, my darling, here we are. I now have a choice. I could continue my lucrative life as a successful lawyer, or I could accept the job that is offered to me by our friend Arthur Seyss-Inquart. What should I do? And she says, take the job in government, get involved. She was absolutely complicit, and she knew everything. He would write to her at each stage. He does the job in Vienna, then he goes to Krakow, where he is the one who constructs the famous, infamous, notorious, terrible Krakow ghetto, does a fine job, and Himmler and Hitler then appoint him to Lemberg, where his job is the implementation of the final solution, the mass murder of more than 500,000 human beings on the territory that he ran, and Charlotte knows everything. So for me, that's the vital fourth strand.
And I should have said that, obviously you mentioned, I've seen this a few times, and you mentioned it just this afternoon, where you said it's also a story about love. It's this love story. And so that's that relationship between Otto and Charlotte. You know,
well, that's part of the complexity, Thorin, is, you know, I never call Wächter or Hans Frank a monster. Here's my position. They did monstrous and terrible things. But, and this is what is so disturbing, they were also capable of love, affection, generosity, decency, humanity, being a parent, being a lover, being a husband, so on and so forth. And what I've wanted to show in the book is how the two hang together, the horror and the humanity, because it raises a fundamental question, of course, of who is capable of doing these kinds of things.
You know, that gets to something I wanted to ask you about. At one point in your book, you say the collected papers of Charlotte Wächter were a private act of memory, but also an expression of advocacy. Could you tell us a little more about what's the advocacy part of this? What did you mean?
Sure. So let's divide. So they spend 20 years together. Okay, they meet on the 6th of April, 1929. He dies. They meet in Vienna. He dies on the 16th of July, 13th of July, 1949. So they have 20 years together. Those 20 years, they marry in 32 because she has become pregnant. He doesn't want to get married, but his best mate, Manny Browning, basically makes him do the honorable thing. They marry in 32, and then their life goes from 32 to 45. So they've had 15 years together, where basically Otto's in control. He's the powerful one. He's got power, he's having affairs, she's produced 6 children. They have a pretty happy family life together, but he's up to all sorts of other stuff. And then on the 9th of May, 1945, he disappears off the face of the earth. And the second part of the book looks at what happens, how he escapes, how he looks after himself. And we can talk a little bit more about that in due course, how he gets to Rome and how he wants to get on the Ratline to get to Argentina, like Mengele, like Eichmann. That's the path that he's on, helped by exactly the same people. He never gets there, of course, because he dies. But the last 5 years of their relationship, the tables are completely turned. Otto is utterly dependent on his wife. And that, for me, is fascinating. I could have ended the book there in 49, but I didn't, because Charlotta lives for another 36 years until 1985. And as her daughter-in-law, Horst's wife, whispered to me one day on my visit to their home, an extraordinary dilapidated castle in northern Austria, Jacqueline says to me, you know, Charlotta was a Nazi until the day she died. And what does she do in those 36 years? She takes the Wächter name out of the history books. So if an Austrian radio station broadcasts something about Otto and she doesn't like what they're saying about him, she writes to the broadcaster, goes and sees them and lobbies to make sure they don't talk about him again. And the upshot is, by the time I come on the scene, the Wächter name has been scrubbed out of history. Everyone's forgotten about it. And that was her advocacy. That was what she wanted to do. Until along arrives Muggins in about 2010, procures these documents for myself to do research on, writes a book, does a podcast, writes a book. And of course, today in the New York Times, in the book review, you've got a big review, a very generous review, but it's even worse. You've got, from the Wächter family perspective, you've got, you know, it's in the Weekender section. If you go on the website, you'll find photographs and lots of things. It's in a sense the ultimate coming back to the fore of a story that she successfully whitewashed out of history. And that, of course, has given rise to all sorts of problems between me and certain members of the Wächter family in terms of what I have done.
You know, it's interesting because you also describe Horst, Otto and Charlotta's youngest child, and the one who had these papers, and the guy who you spoke to, as very much dedicated to his mother's memory, and believing that his task was somehow to continue what she had done. And yet, he has been the one who shared this information so openly with you, and has led to the, you know, all of what you just described, and the kind of public awareness of his father. And it's his siblings, as I understand it from your book, his siblings are the ones who were really trying were against what he was doing, against him sharing the material with you. What are the different motivations of Horst versus his siblings?
So here's the real complexity of the issue. I mean, this is such a complex story at so many levels. On the one hand, there's my relationship to the Wächters. After all, Otto Wächter was responsible for the extermination of 80 members of my grandfather's family. So there's that personal connection, which of course complicates matters. Then there is the fact that despite that, I of course do not hold Horst, who was born in 1939, responsible for the wrongs of his father. or of his mother. He was a kid. He was, 6 years old when his father disappeared. Third point that I'd make is the complexity is, although I disagree with Horst's effort to find the good in his father, to interpret the documents in a way in which he accepts his father was present, his father was an SS Brigadeführer, was a governor, was there, that the Nazis murdered millions of people. He accepts all of that, but he says, my father was not criminally responsible, which I am in fundamental disagreement with. But the upshot in terms of the relationship is I like him. And I, through Nicholas and him, have come to know people from the other side of the story. I mean, my family story, for those who've read East West Street will know, is being the other side of the story, the victim side. I had never met people, Nicholas Frank, for example, who allowed me to ask myself the question, what's it like to be the son of a man who is hanged at Nuremberg for murdering 4 million human beings? It's overwhelming. So it's a very, very complex relationship. And you're right. On the one hand, although I'm in fundamental disagreement with Horst, and the book is, in part about our disagreements, and the readers will form their own view about who they're with on the substance and where the evidence goes. The fact is, I have gratitude that he has given me the material and allowed it to be made available and put it on the website. You can just, Google Wächter and US Holocaust Memorial Museum, and you can go and look at all the family archive. And that's an incredible thing. And it's got him into terrible difficulty with his siblings and with his nephews and nieces. There are 23 grandchildren. Otto and Charlotte have produced 23 grandchildren. And let us say they are not exactly thrilled that all of this has been put into the public domain, and they blame Uncle Horst for all of this. We can go even further. I don't want to give too much away, but there is the question of Horst and Jacqueline's own child. So the granddaughter of Otto and Charlotte, with whom I'm in contact, who takes a different view from her father. And this becomes very dramatic at the end of the book, dramatic for me at least. And I think for many readers, I've had a lot of letters about that.
You mentioned something that I had planned to bring up, which was towards the end of your book, you talk about asking a friend of yours, a Spanish writer, about why he's interested in the story of Otto Wächter and in the visit to a particular hospital that you go to at the end of the story. And you quote his response, which was, "It is more important to understand the butcher than the victim." And as someone, as you say, who's personally connected to the victim's side of this, you have this family that was murdered. I was very interested to read that line, and I wondered if you could just kind of explore it with me or talk.
Sure. So there's a big story behind that line, and reasonable people will agree or disagree with that line. I put it in, it's slightly a provocation. I put it in as a quote. It represents that he's a great writer called Javier Cercas. The book you should read if you're interested, one of the finest books I've ever read, is called Soldiers of Salamis. He's very famous in Europe, quite well known in America, but Cercas, C-E-R-C-A-S. So here was the story. I had come to know him, and I was having trouble getting into the Santo Spiritu Hospital, the 15th century extraordinary building in Rome, run by the Vatican, where Wächter died on the 13th of July, 1949. You know, I'm a courtroom litigator, so for me, facts, evidence are really important. And I wanted to get into the room. I wanted to be in that space, an extraordinary room, and I couldn't get in. It was being renovated. No, we can't let you in, it's closed, blah, blah, blah. So, I thought, okay, that's it. I'm not going to be able to get in. June 2019. My friend Javier Cerca says, "Oh, I'm going to Rome. I've been asked to give a lecture by the Pope on faith and literature." And I say, "Oh, well, if you're going to be in Rome, you might meet a few cardinals and bishops. If you find one who's friendly, tell them you've got this mate in England who would love to get into this hospital, and can they help?" He goes to Rome. I'm actually crossing the Dolomites with my 19-year-old daughter, following in the footsteps of Wächter as he escaped. When we get to Bolzano and the phone starts going crazy, and it's text messages from Javier in Rome saying, come straight away to Rome, come straight away to Rome. Anyway, I go to Rome, he tells me what's happened. After his event, there's a cocktail reception, and a bishop, an Irish bishop, is in conversation with him, with an Italian cardinal. And my name comes up, and the Irish bishop says, Sands, Philippe Sands. Javier says, yes. He said, isn't he the guy who made that BBC podcast called The Ratline? And Javier says, yes. And the bishop says, not very complimentary about the Vatican, but I must say I loved it. I'd love to meet him. And the bishop got me into the room. Not only did he get me into the room, he invited Javier and I to a private tour of the Sistine Chapel, literally the two of us. And we were sitting there in the Sistine Chapel, and I turned to Javier and I said, why are you so interested in Charlotta and Otto? And he said the words, because it's more important to know the butcher than the perpetrator. What he means is, if we're going to stop these horrors from happening, we need to understand what motivates these people and the lives in which they operate. You know, this is very relevant right now. I mean, not just in places like Poland and Hungary, but I'm afraid also in countries like the United Kingdom and the United States, which have or have had populist and xenophobic administrations. And, you know, you've got the events of the 6th of January fresh in your mind. You've seen some of the dreadful photographs which we watched. I'm married to a New Yorker, so this is a big part of our lives. What makes these people do what they do? That's what the quote is intended to get at. And the book, in a sense, is intended to help us understand how a highly cultured, highly educated man and woman like Otto and Charlotta can embrace mass murder. How does it happen? And the story that I describe shows how lines get crossed. And I think the message for today, and the reason the book has had so much resonance, including in the United States, I was surprised it's had much more pickup than East-West Street, is because I describe how lines are crossed. How Wächter, when he's 22, 23, starts throwing stones at Jews. And from throwing stones, you join the party. From joining the party, you attack the chancellor. There was the famous July Putsch in 1934, the failed insurrection, a bit like the 6th of January. And Wächter has to flee, but he comes back 4 years later triumphant. And there's a big message there, I think, for why we need to be on our guard right now.
I mean, I picked up on that because I too have spent many years actually trying to explore and trying to understand the perpetrators, and I felt pushback from people who say that the attention should be on the victims, not the perpetrators. But I think, as you've said, to understand how that process worked and how people became Nazis is important for us to think about today, about how extremists go from being on the fringe to playing central roles in our society.
Just to be clear on that, Thorin, I mean, East-West Street, of course, has as one of its 4 characters my grandfather. And part of my exercise was precisely to understand the victims, because I wanted to put names and faces to people who were part of my childhood, who were evoked, but of course were never talked about, because as for many people, I'm sure, who are watching now, this was a period of silence where you just did not talk about these things because they were so painful. So for me, it's not either or. It's not the victim or the perpetrator. Of course, we must know, because by knowing who the victims are, their names, the ages, the lives they had and everything, you make it real. And once you make it real, the horror really reinforces why these things must never, never, never happen. But at the end of the day, it's not the victims that cause it. There are a relatively small number of people out there who play an absolutely catalytic role. And that's what, in a sense, this book is about. How does a family allow this to happen? And I don't think that's been done before.
Very nicely said. I want to pick up, I see some questions coming in. I want to get to them, but I also just want to pick up on a couple of other things that you've mentioned. And one is this, much of the book is showing you going to these places. You said following the footsteps of Wächter, even to the point where you're traipsing up the Alps in the snow with your daughter.
Yeah.
why is it so important to go to these places? And you, it's not just there. It's, you know, and it's not just the hospital. I mean, really, you're following Otto's footsteps throughout this book. So why go to all that length?
Because I mean, this book gets classified in Germany, where they like to classify books in particular ways, as literary nonfiction. That is to say, it's not a history book, it's not biography, it's not a legal book, it's a literary book. And part of the function of literature is to open up the imagination. And to open up the imagination, certainly for me, I need to go there. I need to see the four walls of the room in which Wächter died to get a sense of the moment when he died. I need to go to the places where he occupied and exercised power. I need to see the mass graves. I need to see the rooms, the palaces that he constructed for himself. I need to hold the painting that he stole. They stole art. I mean, they just did the most terrible things, because this allows you to understand in a much more direct way. I'm, you know, second or third generation in a sense, so I think it's easier for me to do than first generation. And I'm trained as a litigator, which means I'm hardened on the outside, complex conversations. I don't lose my cool. I don't get upset. Some occasionally I do, but most of it I don't. And I think that to be in a place, whether it's a place of mass murder, mass grave, I mean, East West Street finishes at the mass grave where my grandfather's family are still today, unmarked. I mean, it's a shocking place. But also to be in the Wächter house, to meet the family members, to go to Salzburg, to go to Vienna, to go to Krakow, to go to Lemberg, to meet one of the people living in Krakow who remembers what the Wächters did, to meet the extraordinary pediatrician in New York City, Michael Katz, who's in the book, you know, who's now vice president of March of Dimes, age 93, and who was in the ghetto in Lvov and remembers what was done. There's no substitute for going and talking and seeing as much firsthand as you can to try to capture the things of beauty and the things of horror, because the page then conveys that, I think, in a much more powerful way. And I think the reason both books have resonated, in part, is that my style of writing is not to ram my conclusions down the throat of the reader, but to allow them to imagine the decision-making process on both sides of the story.
Well, I do think you're very effective at describing the places you visit and describing why they're important. I found myself going to Google and looking at some of the buildings, you know, you have some of the images in your book, but to look at, you know, where was Wächter's palace in Krakow, or where was his summer house. So I was lured in by some of that geographic focus.
And in relation to the photographs, there's a small number of people who've complained that the photographs are too indistinct or too small or too this or too that. That is purposeful, because I think photographs are there to open up the imagination. They must not be too clear or too precise. The reader needs to look at them closely and say, what is this? Who is this person? What are they doing? What are they holding? What, you know, on the cover of the book, there's a photograph of Otto and Charlotte and Horst and Trouter. And if you look at it very closely, you'll see that Otto's finger is in a curious way on his son's shoulder. And I think photographs work their own magic in opening up the imagination. And what you say makes me happy, because that's what I want people to do, to go and start ferreting around and seeing what they can find. And of course, for a lot of readers, these stories will touch them very personally. And so it is difficult material, and it has to be treated carefully and with respect, and not, you've understood what I'm saying. How you write about these things is, I think, very, very delicate.
Absolutely. One more question before we get to some of the ones that are coming in. Just the Ratline, the name of the book. You've mentioned something about this escape route. Can you just tell us a little more about it? And I know you bring up in your book that it's more complicated than just the Nazi escape route. And a big part of the end of your book is the change from the American perspective. And yeah, okay, sorry, go for it.
No, Thorin, this is the shocker. This is not what I expected. So for the first 5 or 6 years that I knew Horst, and I'm trying to persuade him about the criminality of his father, failing miserably, I have to say. I'm not really interested in what happened after the war, but when he gives me the materials, it's extraordinary. I mean, everything from the way Charlotte buried him, her husband, 5 times. You couldn't invent these kinds of things. And what I became interested in was how he escaped and what happened when he got to Rome. And extraordinarily, for the first time, no one's ever seen this material before, we've got the internal diaries and papers of a man who's trying to get himself onto the Ratline to Argentina to escape because he's been indicted for murdering hundreds of thousands of people. Now, here it gets complicated because the letters and the diaries are all coded, because Werther and Charlotte, who wrote to each other 2 or 3 times a week, were frightened that the military censors in occupied Austria and in Italy were spotting their letters. So we spent 4 years, myself and 4 wonderful researchers, decoding all the names, finding out who was who. And what we uncovered was frankly a shocker, because with the help of wonderful Norman Goder down in Florida, professor at Florida University, and David Kurtzer at Brown University, we came across something called Project Los Angeles. What is Project Los Angeles? 1947. The United States Army Counterintelligence Corps is charged with hunting Nazis. But it turns on a sixpence, as John le Carre puts it, and decides, hey, these Nazis have information. They know who the communists are, and the communists are the new enemy. So let's make use of these characters. Let's start recruiting them. And unbelievably, the man who is recruited to run Project Los Angeles is a major SS mass murderer called Karl Haas. He, in turn, is authorized by the wonderfully named Thomas Lucid of the 430th Division of the US Army CIC to recruit 8 people to help him in the hunt against communism in Italy. He hires 3 more Nazis, all mass murderers, 3 members of the Italian fascist party, including the Secretary General, who's in prison, and most unbelievably of all for me, 2 senior Vatican officials, an Austrian bishop called Alois Hudal, who helped Mengele escape, who helped Priebke escape. I mean, just astonishing. And even more astonishing, the Pope's personal press spokesman, a cardinal, was an American agent for 4 years, paid $50 in cash every month. They all were. In other words, the Americans knew all about the Ratline. They knew all about the escape route. They knew all about the presence of Nazis in Rome and other parts of Europe, and they used them to take on the new enemy. So confused was I by all of this that I went to consult. I have many great fortunes, but one is that my neighbor was the wonderful writer John le Carre, who sadly died a few weeks ago. And I went to see him because I thought, okay, we're into espionage and the Cold War. He knows a thing or two about espionage and the Cold War. So he said, sure, come over. I sat with him for a few hours. And the first thing he said to me is, it's all in the book, you'll be able to read it. He says, Philippe, I was there in 49. I said, what? He said, yeah, I was 18 years old. I was a young British soldier and my job was to interrogate Germans. I said, what, to prosecute them? The criminals, the war criminals, the crimes against humanity, the génocidaires? He said, no, to recruit them. I said, what? He said, yeah, it was really confusing. I had grown up as a kid being told the Nazis were the worst of the worst. And now they were our new allies and our friends. And this is the shocking part of the story. And this is why I ended up in Albuquerque, New Mexico, with the absolutely marvelous son of Thomas Lucid, showing me many extraordinary artifacts, which we can talk a little bit more about in questions, but it's a very complex story. And for your museum, and many museums, I think this is a bit of a shocker. It was a shock for me, I can tell you.
Yeah, and yet you describe it in the book in a way that really helps us understand it and think about this strange twist. Really very engaging and frightening, but a way of the past. That's the way that history was. Let me turn to a couple of the questions that have coming in. There are a couple about the Vatican and your work with the Vatican, and there's somebody who's writing in who apparently is living in Bolzano and asked about Bishop Hudal, who you talk about. Could you talk a little more about him and what was your experience in working with the Vatican archives?
Well, that's a wonderful question, and greetings to a viewer in Bolzano. It's one of the wonderful things about these Zoom virtual meetings is you truly get a big audience. So I didn't know anything about Alois Hudal when I began, and Vesta spent time in Bolzano, as you'll find in the book. On the 29th of April, 1949, Vesta arrives on the run in Rome. And the first person he meets, as he describes in a letter to Charlotta, is a religious gentleman. He never names the religious gentleman, and it took us a little time to work out who it was. It was Alois Hudal, the leading Austrian bishop in the Vatican, who runs an institute called the Anima Institute, the Teutonic, associated with the Teutonic Institute in the Vatican, the Germanic Austrian group. And Hudal is very famous because he is the one who helped Mengele and Priebke and many, I mean, hundreds, if not thousands of others. And it turns out Alois Hudal was a spy for the Americans, recruited between 47 and 51, paid $50 in cash each month for 4 years. I mean, it's a real shocker. Hudal was at the Anima Institute. I went to the archive there. The archivist, who literally is straight out of central casting, Dr. X, okay, you could not invent someone who is more like the archivist of an institute run by a Nazi bishop. I mean, it was really, but he was very generous, gave me access to what he had, but it was clear to me that what he had been filtered, shall we say. I went with Horst, and at some point in all the documents, Horst finds a letter from his mother, which causes him to have a big cry because it's very distressing for him, the son, to be confronted with all of these things. In due course, I've mentioned Bishop Tigay. Things have opened up and I've been given access to other things. I mean, we don't know. The $64 million question, of course, is what did Pius XII know? And I don't have an answer. That would be for David Kurtzer and others to give answers to. But what we can say for sure is elements of the Vatican were involved in the escape of senior Nazis, including Otto Wächter. What we don't know is how high up the pecking order it went and whether the main man himself was involved. Equally, we don't know on the American side. You know, Lucid was not off on a frolic. It plainly had authorization from senior people in the Truman administration, but did President Truman know? I have no idea. That will be for others to work out. But I can say this, under Pope Francis, I've had tremendous assistance from the Vatican. The doors have not been closed, quite the opposite. And I think under this regime, there is genuinely a desire to throw light on what's happened. And as you will know, Pope Francis has opened the archive of Pius XII. Because of COVID, we're not able to get access to all of the material now, but I think over time we will get a much better picture about what Pius XII did and did not know and did not do. And so the Vatican story remains a very, very central story in the whole thing.
Let me ask you to back up. Somebody's asking here about what role did Otto Wächter play in the mass murder in Lviv? And you talked about his role in Krakow. What else was he doing? What was he responsible for?
I'm afraid it's a terrible story. He was the governor. He was the head of the civilian administration, and he was also a very senior SS officer. By 1945, he was one rank only below Heinrich Himmler, who was his mentor. I've got a lot of material in the book about it. On the 20th, the final solution is essentially initiated by the Wannsee Conference in January 1942. And it is progressively implemented on the territory of occupied Poland, including Lemberg. And it's plain that in February 42, Wächter was moved on the personal orders of Hitler from Krakow to Lemberg to oversee the mass murder of every Jew living in the city and in District Galicia. That was his job. On the 1st of August 1942, Hans Frank arrives in Lemberg, speaks in the same room in which I will deliver a lecture 70 years later to announce the extermination of every Jew on the territory. And he directs his words to Otto Wächter, who's sitting in the front row. 3 weeks later, Himmler arrives in Lemberg, Lvov, because there's a suspicion, can we rely on Wächter to do the necessary? And all of this is recorded, it's in the Himmler diaries, I've dug them all up. Himmler says to Wächter, look, if you don't want to stay, and between the lines do the necessary, you can go back to Vienna and you can have a desk job. He says, no, I'm staying, I'm not going anywhere. And in January 43, there is an exchange of letters with Himmler in which Himmler congratulates him for the work he has done. By then, 65 to 70% of the Jews have been murdered. And he stays to finish off the job. But it's not just in the public correspondence. And this is why I'm absolutely persuaded that to really understand how things are done, go to the private correspondence, because that's where the secrets drop out. There's a shocking letter at the end of August 1942, when Charlotte is with the children at Zell am See in the fine house that has been basically expropriated and given to them. And Otto is in Lemberg and he writes to her, another one of these, my darling letters, wonderful, but I miss you. Lot of work to be done, 250,000 Poles have been sent to the Reich as slave labor. He uses another term, obviously. The Judenaktionen is well underway, the great Jewish action, which is, their formulation was the evacuation, but it's the extermination. Everyone knows what was going on. And as the letter proceeds, he says it's, because of all the things that are going on, there's no Jews around and no one to put powder on the tennis court. So not only does he know, but she knows. It's written about in the personal letters. He was absolutely deeply implicated. He was involved in all the transportations, in the roundups, in the selections, and he is 100% a mass murderer on an industrial scale. It is shocking. And that was important for me to prove, because Horst would keep saying to me, there's no proof, there's no proof, there's no proof. And I made it my business over 4 years to go to the archives, as you know, you've read the book, and find the proof, including, most shockingly, a series of photographs which show Wächter overseeing the shooting of 55 Poles on the personal orders of Adolf Hitler. So there's no escaping, there's no ambiguity, there's no escaping what Wächter did.
Yeah, those photos that you show, that series of 3 photographs, really very powerful, and you build to it in such a skillful way, so that they really mean something when we come to them in the book and we can understand their importance. Somebody else is raising a question that ties into, I think, the very motivation for, as you've described it, for your writing, which is just about how do you deal with the fact that your own family members were murdered, and yet the descendants, well, first of all, the perpetrators, some of the perpetrators went on to live very happily, even with the assistance of the American government, and their descendants certainly are, flourishing. And yet you describe Horst as a nice man and a guy you're friends with. So can you just help us understand that?
It's really complex. I mean, I'm not as good friends with him as I am with Nicholas. Nicholas, I can honestly say, is a man I love. I don't say that about Horst. I think of Horst as someone who is a damaged person. You know, people who are watching, if they're interested in watching a movie, you can get it on, I think it's on Netflix, certainly on Amazon and iTunes, Apple. It's called a BBC documentary called My Nazi Legacy, What Our Fathers Did. And it's my trip to Lemberg with Nicholas and Horst. And there's a moment in that film, I remember the interview so well, we did it in his house in the Schloss in Hagenberg, where I'm asking Horst about the end of the war. And Horst describes his birthday party when he was 6 years old in April 1945, and he starts weeping as he tells the story when he knew it was all over and the family was going to collapse. And I'm able to understand that Horst, in a different way, is a victim of that period. He's been sold a lie by his mother. He'll say to me, I don't love my father. I didn't know my father. I love my mother. My mother looked after me in these difficult times, including after the war. She loved her husband, my father, and it's my duty as a son to do the best to find the good in my father, to honor my mother. Now, you can agree and disagree with how he goes about doing it, but it's not a dishonorable instinct of a child who really loves his mother. I happen to think that Charlotta is both repellent and fascinating. You know, I don't have any warmth towards Charlotta. I can tell you she's in it up to her neck, but she's a fascinating character. And Horst loves his mum to bits. Now, this is the difficulty. You know, how would we feel if our father had killed 500,000 people? I mean, what would happen? Can we put our hands on our hearts and say, I would stop loving my dad? No, I wouldn't have anything to do with him anymore. Or you never know your father, but your mother loved your dad, who was a mass murderer. These are really complex questions. And all I ask of Horst is to engage honestly with the facts. He's got up to about 70%. He's given me everything, which is every time a document's missing, I'll call him up, I'll send him an email, I'll say, look, there's one seems to be missing. He'll say, let me go and find it, and I'll send it to you, and he finds it and sends it. And I'm going to take it a step further. In the course of my interactions with him, I have discovered that he was in possession of some of his parents' looted artifacts. Okay, and I said to him, Horst, you've got to give this stuff back. You can't hold on to this stuff. And I'm going to give him real credit. He's given it all back. What remains is a China tea set, which was looted from the family of Bettina Mendel, who ran the famous Ankerbrot bakery in Vienna. They got the Mendel villa. And Horst still has this extraordinary tea set. Well, Bettina Mendel's daughter, Phyllis, lives in Brisbane, Australia. And I've tracked her down and I've said, oh, look, I found this tea set. Do you want it back? And she says, well, I don't care so much, but her sons want it back. So with the intervention of a wonderful Australian TV company, because it cost an arm and a leg to send this stuff from Vienna to Brisbane, Australia, we've now arranged, and Horst has agreed, of course it must go back. And so this is the complexity. On the one hand, you know, what he says about his dad is nonsense. He's in total denial. On the other hand, he wants to do the right thing. If he was a Nazi, if he was an anti-Semite, if he was a Holocaust denier, I wouldn't be engaging with him. But he's none of those things. And that's the key to understanding. He's a little boy who's struggling to keep his life together, who has lived for his entire life with the lies of his mother. And right at the end of his life, along comes this bloke from London who he likes. And he says to me, part of the reason I like you is because I feel bad about what happened to your grandfather's family and I want to do the right thing. But he can't quite bring himself to go all the way, which is where his daughter enters the story. And I'll just say this, the book ends with his daughter. And the last line of the book, literally, has caused Horst to disinherit his daughter. This is causing even more complexity. You see, it just goes on and on. People think history finishes 80 years ago. You know from your museum, it does not. It goes on all the different sides, the legacy of these events. And that's a universal theme. It happens in my cases in Rwanda, in Yugoslavia, anywhere I do cases of atrocity. It doesn't stop. It leaves a legacy of pain and secrecy and deceit and lies and incomprehension that goes on and on and on. And I think part of our function, this is where we're joined, Thorin, you with your museum, me with my books. It's not that we're pointing the finger of blame, it's we're trying to make material available so people, decent folk, can understand what happened precisely in order to stop it from happening again.
Absolutely, absolutely. Somebody's asking, and I want to put it in the chat, tell me the name of the BBC documentary that...
well, I think it varied. We had a big fight between the Americans and the English about what works. If you just type in My Nazi Legacy, What Our Fathers Did, it's definitely on Amazon.com.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm sure people can find it.
It's in Prime Video. It's in Prime Video. It's called What Our Fathers Did, A Nazi Legacy. And I'm very pleased to tell you it's only got 5 stars and it's like 90% on Rotten Tomatoes. And everyone who sees it says it's very interesting.
There's one other question that I wanted to get to, and I know our time is running short. I have one follow-up as well. And that is just about what's your sense about how others have viewed the descendants of Nazis? And you've kind of been in this circle and been working very closely with a number of descendants. And so are you an outlier? Are you, is your ability to kind of look at those descendants as not responsible and to learn from them something that's different than others? What do other people think, if you can?
It's been interesting. I've had the project as a whole, East-West Street and and the Ratline, I've just had literally thousands of letters. And the great majority come from people who are on my side of the story. And I haven't had, I think, a single angry letter. The letters are of a kind which say, thank you, Mr. Sands, for helping me understand what happened in a way that is not horrific, but tells the story honestly and allows me to know where I can go to find out about my own family. I think what I would say is this. I'm very fortunate in having the training as a courtroom litigator and as a professor. I teach at London University, I teach at Harvard Law School. So you're trained to deal with material that's complex and present it in an accessible way. One of the things I've learned is that readers are really smart and they can deal with complexity. That's not an issue. But it's in the gathering of the materials, getting to know Horst. Not everyone is going to have 20 meetings with Horst over 10 years, which is what I've done. Not everyone's going to spend hundreds of hours with this guy because it's going to make them hurt. It's going to hurt. It's going to be painful. There's going to be weeping. Somehow, because of my professional and academic training, I'm able to protect myself. That's not to say that some of the stuff doesn't hurt me very, very deeply. This is my grandparents we're talking about. Vecht is responsible for heaping untold misery on some of the people I love most in my life, my beloved grandparents, who are no longer with us, obviously. And so it's very difficult. There's one moment in the film, I pride myself, the expression in London is losing your rag. And I pride myself that I never lost my rag with Horst, except on one occasion. And that occasion was in the shooting of the film in front of a TV camera, in front of a film camera. The film was made by my friend David Evans, who's also a director of Downton Abbey, you'll be interested to know. And he's my friend from university, and he was there. And what had happened was Horst said, there's no proof about what my father did. So I thought, no, I'm gonna find the proof. I'm a lawyer, I know where to find things. I'm gonna go to the archives and I found the act of indictment. Wanted for mass murder, 100,000 or more citizens of Poland, all Jews. And I say to David Evans, look, should I give Horst the heads up before I show this to him in Lemberg? He said, no. Let's just show him and film the reaction. So it's the US indictment, okay, US-Polish indictment. I mean, for mass murder, it's a shocking document. It's on the film, you can see on the film. Horst looks at it and he reads it and he says, yes, of course. I said, what do you mean, yes, of course? He says, it's a Soviet document. The Poles, by then, they were in the pockets of the Soviets. This is just invented, this document. And I said, it's not invented. And I got really upset with him. And that's the only moment that's happened. And I was very upset with myself for getting upset with him, and even more upset that that it happened on camera. And then David Evans said, well, should we include that in the film or not? And I said, David, it's your film. I'm not the filmmaker, you're the director. Our deal is, it's your film, and you must make the film you want. My beloved mother-in-law in New York calls it the elder abuse scene. I don't think it's quite that bad, but I got really upset. So there are moments also in the book of high emotion, but it's moderated. And because I tend to be an optimistic person, I try in the end, out of this terrible story, this just terrible set of mass murders, to find the silver lining. You know, Leonard Cohen's great song, there's a crack in everything, that's how the light gets in. And out of this terrible story, things emerged. The legal concept of crimes against humanity, the legal concept of genocide, a trial at Nuremberg, various other things. And in a sense, this book is the judgment of Otto Wächter that no court ever delivered in relation to him. That's part of why I wrote this book.
That is a very good way to finish our conversation. I want to thank you so much for joining us and for the book. Really a super book that opens our eyes to much of this history that, as you say, had kind of been forgotten or hidden away actively, and you draw our attention to it. One last question for you. It is Super Bowl Sunday. I know you're not an American, but I'm going to ask, who are you rooting for, Kansas City or the Tampa Bay Buccaneers? Okay, do you know who I'm going to go for? I'm going to go for Kansas City, and I'm going to tell you why I'm going to go for Kansas City. Have we got time to finish with one little story? Of course. Here's why I'm going to go for Kansas City. So Otto Wächter dies on the 13th of July, 1949, and he's buried in the Central Cemetery, the Verano Cemetery in Rome. 10 years later, Bishop Hudal gets in touch with Charlotte Wächter and says, oh, Frau Wächter, I forgot to tell you, Baroness Wächter, I forgot to tell you, as your husband lay dying in my arms, he made me promise to tell you that he wanted to be buried in the homeland in Austria. Could you come and get him? This is 10 years later, okay? 1960. So she says, all right, but we'll have to get him exhumed and I'll need permission from the Italian authorities to take my husband's corpse from Italy to Austria. She makes the application from the Italian authorities refused. So what happens instead? She gets permission to take the exhumed body of her husband to Palermo in Sicily, where one of her daughters lives, where one of their children lives, and is married an Italian. She's going to build a mausoleum in honor of Otto. She drives down to Rome from Austria. The corpse is taken out of the ground. It's loaded into the car. Interestingly, her son-in-law, Rupert, gets very upset with her because he doesn't know what's inside the box. She never tells him. And instead of arriving in Palermo, the body disappears. I am getting to the Kansas point, okay? I am getting to the Kansas point. The body disappears. How do I get onto this? In the archives, in the family material, you couldn't invent these people, are press clippings from Italian and German newspapers
Interpol hunts for the body of Nazi war criminal Governor SS Wächter. Okay, and I said to Horst, well, what happened to the body? He smiles and he says, you want to know what happened to the body? I said, yeah, I want to know what happened to the body. He says, mother brought him home. So I said, what do you mean mother brought him home? It's in the book, so you know this story. It's unbelievable. She says, yeah, well, she was by then, 1960, running a small hotel called Haus Wartenberg. It still exists today, being run by her grandson. I went. And it is a pension which she runs as a German language school. And there are 18 and 19-year-olds who are staying in Haus Wartenberg. And I said, well, what happened to the corpse? She said, well, mother buried him in the garden of Haus Wartenberg. I said, you're kidding me. She said, no. So I put all of this in the book. The book came out in England a few months ago, and somehow it reached a retired priest in Kansas City. Okay? And the priest writes me this fantastic letter. And he says, I just wanted you to know, Professor Sands, I was a pupil at Baroness Wächter's Haus Wartenberg in Salzburg in the 1960s. I had absolutely no idea that in the garden where we had breakfast, where we drank our beers, where we had some of our lessons, she had buried her husband under the tree. In fact, he said, I didn't even know. She told me a story that he was some minor official in some faraway place and he'd been killed during the war and blah, 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 and they weren't Nazis and all this kind of stuff. And in honor of this lovely priest who wrote to me, who's now, I think, in his 80s, who's from Kansas City, I'm going to go for Kansas City.
Outstanding. Well, thank you again for taking the time. And I think you've given us a nice sense of the details and the storylines that are woven together here so very nicely in this book that brings us to these places which you travel to. So thanks very much for taking the time and enjoy your evening.
Thank you, Thorin. Thank you, Thorin, and be well and be safe. These are difficult times and hopefully they will get better. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Everybody, have a nice afternoon. Bye-bye.